A freight driver passing through Hand County in late November stopped his team at the edge of a claim road because he could not make sense of what he was seeing. Lantern light spilled from an open cabin door into the dark. Inside, a man crouched in a pit dug beneath his own floor, fitting sections of clay pipe into a trench that ran the length of the room. Two children sat on the remaining floorboards above him, their feet dangling over the edge, eating cold biscuits with bare hands. The stove beside them was unlit. Frost glazed the far wall, and the man in the pit was not stopping. 3 weeks before the first hard freeze of 1887, Oddman Stensland buried his wife and infant son beside a fence line 12 miles north of Miller, Hand County, Dakota Territory. He marked the graves with 2 split cedar stakes because he could not afford stone. Marty had died of childbed fever on a Tuesday. The baby died the same night before Oddman had given him a name. He dug both holes himself in ground that was already starting to resist the spade, and he dug them deep because coyotes had learned where the homesteaders put their dead. He had $22. He had a claim shack 14 feet by 18 feet with one wall still showing daylight between the battens. He had a cracked cast-iron box stove, a straight stovepipe that glowed red at the elbow and threw most of its fury through a tin collar in the roof, and 1 1/4 cords of cottonwood and willow stacked against the south side eye. Wood that a man who knew Dakota would call November fuel and nothing more. He had 2 children. Ragna was 9, Peter was 5, and he had a 160-acre homestead claim filed under the Homestead Act at a cost of $18, requiring 5 years of continuous residence and improvement to prove up. A claim he would lose entirely if he left for the winter. He could not leave. Passage east for 3 would cost more than he carried. His nearest family was in Wisconsin, and they had written twice that year to say the farm could not feed more mouths. The filing fee was already spent. The improvements, the shack, the sod banking, the half-dug well, the fence line where his wife now lay, would revert to open land the moment he abandoned. Everything Marty had died beside would vanish as though it had never been built. So Oddman Stensland stayed, and the cold came anyway. The first visitor after the burial was not a mourner. Hiram Voss arrived on the morning of the 4th day, riding a gray gelding whose breath hung in clouds at the bit. Hiram was 59, a former Army teamster who had survived the hard winter of 1880 to 81, hauling freight between Huron and Pierre when men froze standing up in their wagon boxes. He was now the township road overseer, a man who knew which homesteaders would last and which ones the spring thaw would erase as cleanly as a dragged boot erases a line in dust. He had come because Oddman still owed 3 days of road tax labor, but that was the excuse. The real reason stood in the doorway of the claim shack, measuring 4.5 feet tall with her mother's jaw and her father's silence. Hiram had come because he had buried people on this prairie before, and the math that followed burial was always the same. He tied the gelding and did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the shack the way a man walks a horse he is deciding not to buy. He pressed his thumb against the south wall where the battens gaped. He could fit his little finger through the widest crack. He kicked the base of the woodpile and watched a quarter of the top row shift. Green cottonwood, cut too late, still heavy with moisture that would hiss and spit and give back half the heat of seasoned wood. He crouched at the stovepipe exit where it punched through the roof and rubbed soot between his fingers. The soot was thin. A stove burning hard and fast through light wood. Nothing stored, nothing held. Then he came inside. Ragna was feeding Peter cold porridge near the stove. The stove was lit, but the room held the kind of warmth that disappears the moment you stop feeding it, the warmth of something passing through on its way somewhere else. The stovepipe ran straight from the stove collar through the tin collar in the roof. No elbow, no damper. No attempt to slow the heat on its way out. A chimney that was less a chimney than a hole with a pipe in it, and every stick of wood Oddman burned was a gift to the Dakota sky. Hiram placed his palm against the pipe 4 feet above the stove, hot enough to flinch from. Then he walked to the far corner of the room, where Ragna's pallet lay against the sod wall, and placed the same palm flat against the wall. Frost crystals crumbled under his fingers. 14 feet separated the stove from that corner. 14 feet, and the difference between them was the difference between November and January. "You have one room," Hiram said, "one poor stove, and wood enough for November if the weather stays kind." Odmund said nothing. He was standing near the door with a whittled measuring stick in his hand, marking something on the wall frame that Hiram could not read. "Dakota does not stay kind," Hiram said. He pulled a stub of pencil from his coat and did the arithmetic on the back of a road tax receipt. A family of 3 in a drafty claim shack. Gaps in the wall. A crawlspace floor that let wind through. A stove that could not hold a fire for more than 4 hours. Needed 6 cords minimum to survive to April. More if sickness came. More if the wind shifted north for weeks instead of days and drove the temperature to 30 below and held it there the way a hand holds a throat. 6 cords was roughly 4,800 pounds of dry hardwood, stacked tight, burned careful. Odmund had 1 1/4 cords of green cottonwood. "You have a quarter of what you need," Hiram said, "and half of what you have is green." "I know the numbers," Odmund said. "Then you know what they add up to." Hiram folded the receipt into his coat. "Sell the stove, move into town, find winter labor at the livery or the mill. Let the claim go before the claim takes your children with it." "I cannot let the claim go." "Then send the children to the Bredesen place. Nels has room. His boys are near enough in age." "I will not separate them from me. Not now, not 3 weeks after they watched me put their mother in the ground." Hiram looked at the frost on the far wall. He looked at the red glow of the stovepipe elbow. He looked at the measuring stick in Odmund's hand and the small marks scratched into the frame, marks that meant nothing to him, but that Odmund studied the way a man studies a map of country he intends to cross. "Arithmetic will not make wood grow," Hiram said. He mounted the gelding and rode south toward the Miller Road. Odmund stood in the doorway and watched until the horse was a gray smudge against a gray sky. Then he looked at the measuring stick and the marks he had scratched into the wood. He had been counting the distance between the stovepipe and the far wall. He had been counting how many feet of hot iron stood between the fire and the sky, and how much of that heat the room never touched. He did not yet know what the numbers meant, but he could not stop counting. That night he woke at 2 a.m. to feed the stove. The routine was already killing him, not the waking, but the arithmetic that came with it. Every 4 hours, another armload. Every armload, a subtraction from the pile that he could see through the south wall's gaps, shrinking like a shadow, shortening toward noon. At this rate, the woodpile would last until the 2nd week of December. After that, he would be burning furniture, then floorboards, then the walls of the house he was trying to heat. He opened the stove door and shoved in 3 splits of cottonwood. The fire caught fast. Cottonwood always caught fast and always burned fast, and always left you wondering what you had gained besides the memory of warmth. The stovepipe began to glow. He held his knuckles near it, 2 feet above the stove. The heat stung through his skin. He could feel it radiating through the tin, roaring upward, rushing toward the roof hole and the black prairie sky beyond. Heat made in his house, stolen by his chimney, given to a sky that had never asked for it. He walked to the far corner. Ragna's water cup had ice lace across the surface. The wall breathed cold through the sod banking. The floor, loose boards laid over a shallow crawl space with no insulation and no barrier. Let wind seep through gaps he could feel against his bare feet like cold fingers pressing between the planks. Peter turned in his blankets and said, without waking fully, "Is the baby cold under the ground?" Odmund did not answer. He stood in the dark between the hot pipe and the frozen corner and felt the distance between them like a wound he could measure but not close. All that heat, climbing a straight pipe, warming nothing but the night. All that cold, rising through a floor that had no defense against it. His house was not a shelter. It was a corridor. Heat entered at the stove and exited at the roof, and the room was simply the hallway it passed through. He went back to the stove and placed his palm flat on the floor beside the iron legs. The boards were warm, not from the room, but from below, where the stove's radiant heat had leaked downward through the legs and the thin plank base. Heat traveled down as well as up. The floor near the stove remembered warmth. The floor 6 feet away had already forgotten it. He pressed both palms flat against the warm boards and held them there. Then he moved 2 feet further from the stove and pressed again. Cooler, 2 more feet, cold. By the time he reached the center of the room, the boards felt like what they were. Thin wood over frozen earth, holding nothing. He did not sleep again that night. But by morning, he had an answer to a question he had not yet learned how to ask. The conventional options presented themselves over the next week with the relentless logic of doors slamming shut. Coal from Miller cost $4.50 a ton, delivered on if you had a team to receive the delivery and a shed to keep the coal dry, which Odman did not. He would need at least 3 tons to supplement the wood, and he had $22 for everything: food, materials, medicine, the store account, emergencies that had not yet declared themselves. The freight road was 12 miles of rutted prairie track that would freeze into iron furrows by late November, and hauling anything over it required a wagon team Odman did not own. Cutting riverwood meant a full day's round trip to the James River bottoms with an axe and a borrowed team. Nels Bredesen had offered his team once, and once was all. Nels had 4 sons and his own wood to cut, and a face that said what charity could not, that a man who could not supply his own fuel before his wife died should not have filed on prairie land in the first place. Hay twists, bundles of dried prairie grass twisted tight into logs and burned in the stove, could keep a cook fire alive. Women on the Dakota prairie made them by the hundreds, and they burned fast and cool and filled the room with smoke and left everything smelling of scorched grass from October through March. Hay twists could warm a pot. They could not warm a room, not at 20 below. Not with wind finding every crack in walls that had more cracks than wall. Adding a second stove was fantasy. A second stove meant more pipe, more fuel, and money that existed nowhere. An open fire inside the shack was not viable. The risk of burning the house down was as immediate as the cold the fire was meant to fight. Enclosed stoves were safer than open flames for a reason, but even enclosed stoves demanded safe flues and steady fuel, and Odman's flue was a straight pipe that wasted more heat than it kept, and his fuel was vanishing into the same sky. Every path led to the same wall. Not enough wood, not enough money, not enough time, and 2 children who had already lost their mother and could not afford to lose anything else. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived as a failure. On the second morning of November, Odman burned a full armload of willow at dawn. He packed the stove tight, closed the door, and let it roar. The pipe glowed cherry at the first joint. The room climbed above freezing for the first time in 3 days. Heat filled the space near the stove like something solid. By noon, the fire was ash. The stove was cooling. The room was retreating toward the temperature of the dirt beneath it. And the stovepipe had heated the roof hole and 12 feet of empty sky more thoroughly than it had heated the corner where Ragna slept. Ragna came inside from gathering dried cow chips and stopped in the doorway with black hands and a running nose. She looked at the stove and then at the floor and said, "The floor's colder than the table." Odman looked at her. Then he looked at the floor. Then he looked at the stovepipe. And the memory came. Not sudden. Not like a flame. It rose the way heat rises from stone, slow and steady, arriving long after the source that made it. His mother, Eli Stensland, in the Wisconsin house where he had grown up. His grandfather's stone oven, limestone and river clay, built against the kitchen wall by a man who had learned masonry in a village outside Bergen and carried the knowledge across the Atlantic the way other men carried seed grain. The oven was massive and plain. On winter mornings, his mother would open the iron door, rake the last coals into the ash pan, close the door, and press his palm flat against the outer stone. "Feel the wall," she would say, "not the flame." The fire was dead. The coals were gone. But the stone was warm. Hours after the last ember died, the limestone wall still pushed heat into the kitchen. Slow, even patient heat, like breath from a sleeping animal. not the roaring, fleeting heat of a stove, the stubborn, heavy heat of mass that had swallowed fire and refused to give it back all at once. Odman stood in his claim shack and felt the beginning of something other than dread. The problem was not making heat. His stove made heat. Any fool with a match and dry wood could make heat. The problem was that heat left the house faster than the house could hold it. The stovepipe was a highway to the sky. The floor was a door standing open to the frozen ground. Every stick of wood he burned was a letter addressed to the atmosphere, passing through his home without stopping. What if the heat could be delayed? What if, instead of rushing straight up through a pipe that touched nothing but air, the smoke traveled a longer path? A buried path, through heavy material that would absorb the heat and hold it long after the fire died. His mother's oven did exactly this. Masonry captured fire. Mass released warmth. The burn was fast. The heat was slow. That was the physics, and the physics did not care whether the mass was limestone in Wisconsin or riverstone in Dakota. He could not build a masonry oven. He did not have the stone, the mortar skill, or the time. But he had a floor. He had a crawl space beneath it. And behind Orrin Bell's freight shed, stacked and half forgotten since a drainage project had been postponed until spring, he had seen something that was not meant for smoke, but could carry it. Clay drain tiles. Thick, fired clay, the color of old brick. 6 inches inside diameter, 18 inches long per section, made for water, made to carry flow underground without leaking. A sealed channel was a sealed channel, whether it carried rainwater or smoke. And smoke would follow where pressure sent it, if the chimney above pulled hard enough to draw the exhaust through the entire run. The design took shape over 3 nights of scratching on the dirt floor with a nail while the children slept and the stove threw its useless heat at the sky. Excavate the cabin floor 2 feet below the joists, all of it, 12 by 16 feet inside the sleeping and living area. Lay a serpentine run of clay tile through the pit, winding back and forth in long passes, 48 feet of channel folded beneath a room that measured 14 by 18. Connect the stove outlet to the buried channel's mouth with a pipe collar and a bypass damper, so the stove could fire straight up to warm the chimney before redirecting smoke underground. Surround the clay pipe with loose river stones, fist-sized cobbles from the James River that would press against the warm clay and drink the heat through contact. Cap the stone bed with flat stones and hard-packed clay. Relay the floorboards above with a small gap for air circulation. The smoke would enter the ground hot. It would travel 48 feet through mass that wanted its heat. Every foot of that path, the stones would steal temperature from the clay, and the clay would steal temperature from the smoke. By the time the exhaust finally rose through a vertical chimney at the far end, it would have surrendered the bulk of its warmth to the stone bed beneath the floor, and the floor above would radiate that warmth upward into the room, not the roaring, fleeting heat of the stove itself, but the slow, patient, lasting heat of 9,000 pounds of warmed stone. The measurements mattered because the stakes were measured in degrees, dollars, and days. 32 straight clay tile sections, 6 elbow boxes built from brick scraps and clay mortar at the turns, roughly 8,000 to 9,000 pounds of fist-sized riverstone hauled in repeated loads, a slope of 1-inch rise per 8 feet of horizontal run, so smoke would travel willingly toward the chimney and condensation would drain away from the elbows. 4 clean-out pockets with hand-sized iron lids at each major turn, so soot could be scraped without tearing up the floor. A vertical chimney 12 feet above the stove collar, kept inside the cabin wall as long as possible to hold warmth in the rising column and maintain strong draft. It would cost every dollar he had. Clay tile from Bell's lot, the cracked sections Bell could not sell for drainage, plus lime, a second-hand pipe collar, and enough brick scraps to build the 6 elbows. $22 for materials instead of fuel. If the system worked, the reduced woodpile might last the winter because the stones would multiply each fire's warmth across hours instead of losing it in minutes. If it failed, he would have no money for fuel, no floor to stand on, and a house full of smoke with 2 children asleep inside it. Nels Bredesen found out before Odman had finished loading the tile at Bell's dock. Nels stopped his wagon and watched Odman stacking cracked clay drain tile onto a borrowed handcart. The tiles were heavy for their size, thick-walled, the color of dried blood. They clinked when they touched. "What are you building?" Nels asked. "A floor," Odman said. Nels climbed down. He picked up a tile section and turned it in his calloused hands, looking through the bore the way a man looks down a gun barrel to check the bore for fouling. He set the tile down and looked at the lime, the pipe collar, the borrowed cart. "That is chimney pipe material under a floor. You are running smoke underground." Odman kept stacking. "Smoke travels up," Nels said. He said it without malice, the way a man states that the sun rises east to establish ground that both of them stood on, before pointing out that one of them had walked off the edge. "Smoke travels up because heat rises. Run pipe horizontal under a floor, you will choke that room. You will collect soot in those turns until they plug solid, and your children will die in their sleep breathing what should have gone to the sky." Odman set down the tile he was carrying and turned to face Nels fully. "The chimney still goes up. The vertical stack pulls the same as before. The smoke just travels further before it gets there. 48 feet further, through clay pipe meant for water, with 6 turns, in a space you cannot reach without tearing up the floor. I have cleanouts at every turn. You have theory at every turn. I have seen stovepipe clog at one turn, Odmund. One turn, 4 feet off the stove, in the Anderson place. The room filled so fast the woman could not find the door in the smoke. Her boy pulled her out by her braid." Nels set the tile down on the dock with a sound like a stone dropped on a coffin. "You have lost your wife. You are not thinking straight. Let me take the children for December. Build whatever you like, but do not put them to sleep over a smoke trap." "They will sleep over warm stone," Odman said. "Or they will sleep over frozen dirt. Those are the only 2 choices I have." Nels held his gaze. The moment stretched. Then he shook his head, climbed back up to the seat, and drove on without another word. He had named the real danger: draft, leakage, soot buildup, the lethal arithmetic of carbon and smoke in an enclosed room where children slept 4 feet above a buried channel that had never been tested and never been built by anyone Nels had ever heard of. If Odman could not answer those concerns with a working system, not words, not drawings scratched in dirt, but a burning stove that pulled clean and held, then Nels was right. And being right meant 2 more cedar stakes beside the fence line. Word of the purchase traveled faster than Odman's handcart. By the time he had hauled the first load of tile to the claim shack, 3 miles over frozen ruts with a cart that lost a wheel pin twice, and dumped 4 tiles into a ditch that he had to crawl into to retrieve them. The story had reached every kitchen and store counter in the township. At Bell's store, men gathered around the potbelly stove and traded versions of it the way they traded cartridges. Stensland bought drain tile instead of flour. He is building a chimney under his floor. Grief has broken his head, and now he is breaking his house to match. The phrase that stuck, the one Orrin Bell coined at the counter and repeated to every customer with the careful satisfaction of a man who understands that the right words, spoken at the right counter, can do the work of a foreclosure sign, was simpler. Stensland buried his chimney because he could not afford a roof. Orrin Bell was 48, the freight agent and store creditor who held accounts for half the homesteaders in Hand County. He was not a farmer. He did not plant, dig, or cut wood. He extended credit in autumn, collected with interest in spring, and acquired abandoned improvements at tax sales when the arithmetic finally crushed a family's grip on their land. Odman's claim bordered a planned road spur that would increase the value of every adjacent quarter section. If Odman failed, if his claim reverted, Bell could buy the improvements for less than the store account and hold the land until the road came through. Bell did not need Odman to fail. But failure was the better outcome for his ledger, and mockery was the cheapest tool he owned. The mockery served a function more precise than cruelty. Every joke about the buried chimney pushed Odman further from the community's willingness to help. A man the township pitied might receive a load of firewood left quietly on his step. A man the township laughed at received nothing. Pity opened hands. Laughter closed them. And Bell understood this the way he understood interest rates, as a mechanism that operated whether or not anyone admitted it. Children repeated the phrase at school. Ragna heard it from Nels's second boy, who said it not with malice, but with the careless accuracy of an 11-year-old repeating what his elders found amusing. She came home with her jaw set and her eyes bright with fury. "They say you buried the chimney because your mind is broken," Ragna said. "My mind is measuring," Oddmund said. "That is not the same thing." But he saw the wound in her, and he knew the wound was real, and he knew that the only medicine for it was a warm floor in January, proof that could not be argued with, because it would be standing on it. Bell came to see for himself on the second day of construction. Oddmund had pulled every floorboard and numbered them with charcoal, 1 through 37, each position recorded so the floor could be relaid in the same order, gaps matched, warps accounted for. The boards leaned against the walls. He had begun digging with a spade, a coal scoop, and a broken hoe wrapped in wire where the handle had split. The pit was 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep at its deepest point, barely started, a wound in the cabin floor that made the house look as though it were being destroyed rather than improved. Bell stood in the doorway, wool coat, clean boots, the smell of dry goods and kerosene. He studied the trench, the clay pipe laid in numbered order beside the wall, the bucket of river stones Oddmund had carried from the creek. He studied the children sitting on the remaining floorboards eating cold biscuits, their feet dangling over the open pit. "You tore up your floor," Bell said. "I am rebuilding it." In November. Bell stepped inside and nudged a clay tile with his boot. The tile did not move. "These were meant for Kessler's drainage ditch. He will want them in spring. He will not want cracked ones. You sold me the cracked lot because no one else would buy it." Bell's expression shifted. Not anger, but the look of a man reminded, in front of 2 children, that his sale was clearance, not generosity. He glanced at the cold stove. Oddmund could not fire it with the floor torn up and children in the room. The children ate cold food in a cold room because their father had chosen clay pipe over coal. "How much do you owe me?" Bell asked. $15.70. "I will forgive the debt, all of it. Sign over your improvements and leave before freeze-up. You can start clean somewhere that is not trying to kill your family." $15.70 of freedom, a clean ledger. All it would cost was the claim, the shack, the well, the fence, the graves beside the fence line, and every future Oddmund's children might build on land their mother had died holding. "I will pay in spring," Oddmund said. Bell looked at the trench, the clay pipe, the river stones, the children over the pit. "That chimney will remember the sky," Bell said, "only after your children stop breathing." He turned and left without closing the door. Wind scattered stove ash across the open pit. Peter coughed. Ragna pulled him away from the edge and wrapped her arms around him. She looked at her father with the particular expression of a child who needs to believe the adult in the room has not made a mistake and is no longer entirely certain. Oddmund stood alone in the torn-apart shack with a trench in the floor, 2 children, a pile of cracked clay tile, and no one in the township who believed he was building anything other than a way to die. He picked up the spade. The ground was hard, not frozen yet, but packed Dakota clay that fought the blade at every stroke. Each shovelful sent a jolt through his wrists, up his forearms, into the base of his skull where fatigue had settled like a tenant who would not leave. Ragna hauled dirt in a flour sack to a pile outside the south wall. Peter carried smaller loads in his hands, and most of the dirt fell between the door and the pile, and Oddmund did not correct him because a 5-year-old who was working did not need correction. He needed to be seen. By the end of the first week, 1/3 of the pit was dug. The math: 12 feet by 16 feet, 2 feet deep. 384 cubic feet of packed earth to move by hand. He was averaging about 64 cubic feet per week. 6 weeks to finish the excavation alone, and the excavation was only the beginning. After the pit came the pipe. After the pipe came the stone. After the stone came the mortar. After the mortar came the capstones. After the capstones came the floor. After the floor came the chimney. After the chimney came the test, and after the test came the truth, whether the smoke would follow the path he had built or fill the room the way Nels had promised it would. His palms split along the lines where the spade handle pressed hardest. The cracks ran deep enough to show pink beneath the callus, and they bled every time he closed his hands around the handle. His wedding ring rubbed the raw knuckle until the skin broke open and stayed open. He wrapped his hands in strips torn from a flour sack, and by midday the strips were brown, and he tore another sack to replace them. The calendar did not negotiate. November had begun. 6 weeks until the weather turned hard. 6 weeks to dig, lay 48 feet of pipe, haul 8,000 pounds of stone, seal every joint, build 6 elbow boxes, cap the bed, relay the floor, build the chimney, and test the system. He was already behind. The ground grew harder each night as the frost pushed deeper. Within 2 weeks, the earth would resist the spade entirely, and whatever was not dug by then would not be dug until spring, a spring his children might not reach. At night, he relit the stove on the remaining floor section, and the children slept near it while the open pit gaped beside them in the dark. He hung a quilt between the sleeping area and the trench so Peter would not roll in. The stovepipe still ran straight. The heat still fled. But now, lying on his back at 3 a.m, Odman could see where the heat would go. He could see the serpentine channel, the 48 feet of clay winding through stone, the cobbles packed tight against the pipe. He could see the flat capstones and the tamped clay and the relayed floorboards over a mass that would breathe heat upward the way his mother's oven breathed heat into the kitchen, long after the fire was dead. He could see it. But seeing and building were separated by weeks of labor, thousands of pounds of stone, and the settled conviction of every person he knew that what he was building would fill his children's lungs with smoke before Christmas. The wind found the gap in the south wall. The stovepipe glowed. The heat climbed toward the sky, and the sky took it, and the far corner froze. Odman wrapped his bleeding hands and picked up the spade. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only saw the failure, not the fix? The pit grew by inches. November grew by days, and somewhere to the northwest, beyond the last tree line and the last fence, the winter of 1887 was already gathering itself into the shape of something that would test every joint, every stone, and every breath of trust that Odman Stensland had buried beneath his floor. But before the winter came, a man Odman had never met would arrive on a freight wagon, a Norwegian mason with a limp, a cough, and the one thing Odman needed more than stone or clay or time, someone who did not laugh. By the middle of November, the pit was 2/3 dug, and Odman Stensland had stopped feeling his hands. Not numb, the opposite. His palms had split, scabbed, split again, and finally settled into a state that was not healing, but adaptation. The skin thickened along the lines of the spade handle until the calluses themselves cracked, and he wrapped them in cloth strips and kept digging because the ground was hardening daily, and whatever was not excavated by the first deep frost would stay where it was until spring. He dug in the mornings before light and in the evenings after the children slept. He carried flour sack loads of dirt to the pile outside. He ate standing up. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. His belt cinched 2 holes tighter than the day Marte died, and his coat hung from his shoulders like a coat hung on a fence post. Ragna boiled oats and salt pork and watched him eat without sitting down, and she said nothing because she had learned in the way children learn on the frontier that silence around a working man was not distance but respect. Peter carried stones, not from the river, that required a wagon trip Odman could not yet afford the time to make, but from the creek bed 1/2 mile east, where frost had pushed cobbles up through the mud like loose teeth. Peter filled a lard pail with stones the size of his fist and carried them back in both arms, his chin resting on the top stone to keep the pile from tipping. Each trip took him 40 minutes. Each trip added perhaps 8 pounds to the bucket inside the shack door. At that rate, Peter would need 1,100 trips to fill the stone bed. Odman did not tell him the number. He thanked him for each load. The progress markers told the story the calendar could not. Pit fully excavated by November 20th now, 4 days behind schedule, because a rainstorm on the 16th collapsed the east trench wall and buried 2 tile sections under 300 pounds of wet clay that had to be shoveled out by lantern light while Ragna held the lamp and Peter slept in the one dry corner with his coat pulled over his face. Clay run dry fitted by November 22nd borers, 32 straight tile sections and the first 2 elbow boxes laid out in the serpentine path, each section chalked with an arrow showing the direction of flow. But the joints were open. The elbows were rough, and the mortar that would seal the system against smoke leakage required lime that Odmund had already bought, and lime that Odmund still needed. Bell refused more lime unless Odmund paid cash. The store account was closed. The $22 was gone. Odmund stood at the counter and asked for 4 pounds of lime on credit, and Bell said, "I do not extend credit to a man who is building a grave under his floor." He said it loud enough for the 2 men by the stove to hear. They did not laugh, but they did not argue. Odmund left the store with nothing. Torgrim Asen arrived in Hand County on November 23rd, riding a freight wagon that was not his own. He was 64, a Norwegian-born itinerant mason and kiln repairman who had spent 30 years building lime kilns, bread ovens, and tile stoves in Minnesota settlements from Lanesboro to Fergus Falls. He was short and wide across the shoulders and walked with a limp that he attributed to a kiln collapse in 1879 and never elaborated on. He coughed when the air was cold, and the air in Dakota was always cold, and so he coughed often, a deep, wet sound that he swallowed with a grunt, as though he could push it back down where it came from. Bell had hired him. That was the plain fact of it. Torgrim had come to Hand County because Orrin Bell's store chimney had cracked during the autumn rains, and the mortar needed repointing before winter, and Bell wanted a man who knew brick and lime rather than a farmer with a trowel. The freight wagon dropped Torgrim at the store on a Tuesday morning. He inspected the chimney, named his price, $3, and materials, and began work that afternoon. He finished in 2 days. He would have left on the next freight wagon north. But on the evening of the second day, walking the road past Odmund's claim because the road went that way, Torgrim Asen saw something that made him stop. The cabin door was open. Lantern light spilled from the interior, and a man was crouching in a pit beneath his own floor, dry-fitting clay drain tile into a serpentine path while 2 children sat on the remaining floorboards and watched. Torgrim stood at the edge of the road for a full minute. Then he walked to the cabin. He did not knock. He stepped to the edge of the pit and looked down at the tile run the way a man looks at a piece of handwriting and knows whether the writer is a fool or merely untrained. Odmund looked up. He did not recognize the man. He saw a thick-shouldered stranger with mason's dust on his cuffs and a face that was examining his work without laughing. "You laid the first tile with a rise," Torgrim said. It was not a question. 1 inch per 8 feet, Odmund said, toward the chimney base. "And the turns, you kept them wide. Tight turns trap soot." Torgrim crouched at the edge of the pit. His knees cracked. He reached down and ran a finger over the joint between the first and second tile sections. The joint was dry. No mortar, no seal, just clay pressed against clay with a gap wide enough to slide a fingernail through. "Heat will go where pressure sends it," Torgrim said. "Smoke will go where cracks invite it. You have the path right. Your joints will kill you." Odmund set down the tile he was holding. "I know the joints are open. I need lime. Bell will not sell me lime." Bell is afraid his chimney is the only chimney in the county worth repairing. Torgrim pulled himself upright with a grunt and looked at the stove, the pipe, the tin collar in the roof, and the vertical chimney base that Odmund had not yet built. "You have 3 problems that will end this before the cold does. I can show you what they are, but I do not work for free, and I do not work for men who do not listen." "I am listening," Odmund said. "Then get me a stool. My knees have already said what they think of your pit." Torgrim did not move into the shack. He moved into the shed behind it, a lean-to structure barely large enough for a man to lie down in, with a canvas roof and a plank floor that Odmund had built for tool storage. Torgrim said it was warmer than half the places he had slept since Minnesota, and Odmund believed him because the man said it without self-pity. The arrangement was not charity. Torgrim did not give his labor away. He recognized something in Odman's work, the rise in the pipe, the wide turns, the numbered tiles, that told him this was not a grieving man building nonsense. This was an untrained man building something that a trained man could see the shape of. What Torgrim offered was not rescue, but partnership, and what he asked in return was meals, shelter, and the understanding that when he said again, the joint would be rebuilt until it was right. The first teaching came the next morning. Torgrim made Odmund light a twist of straw at the base of the vertical chimney stub, a 4-foot section of stovepipe rising from the far end of the serpentine run, not yet extended through the roof. They watched the flame. It bent sideways. Then it stood straight. Then it bent again. "Your chimney does not know which way to pull," Torgrim said. "A warm chimney pulls. A cold chimney sits. You have 48 feet of cold clay between the stove and the stack. The smoke will not enter the floor, run until the chimney above is warm enough to draw it." He showed Odmund the solution. A bypass damper at the stove collar, a simple sliding plate that could direct exhaust either straight up through the old pipe hole, warming the vertical chimney, or downward into the buried run. Start every fire with the bypass open. Let the chimney heat for 10 minutes. Then close the bypass gradually and send the smoke underground. The warm chimney would pull. The cold clay would follow. "Draft before heat," Torgrim said. "Always. A cold chimney is a stopped throat. You cannot push air into a throat that will not swallow." The second teaching came 2 days later, when Torgrim rejected every mortar joint Odmund had mixed. Odmund had used river clay and sand, mixed wet and pressed into the gaps. Torgrim scraped a joint with his thumbnail, and the mortar crumbled. "That will crack before December," Torgrim said, "and every crack is a mouth that breathes smoke into the room where your children sleep." He taught Odmund to mix properly clay, lime, sand, ash, and horsehair. The horsehair came from the clippings Nels's boys swept from the livery floor. The lime came from Torgrim's own supply. He had carried 20 pounds in his tool bag and gave 12 to Odmund without discussion. The ash came from the stove. The mixture was thick and fibrous and dried to a hardness that Torgrim tested by striking it with his knuckle. "Seal like smoke is water," Torgrim said. "Every joint, every seam, every place where clay meets clay or clay meets brick. If water would leak through, smoke will find it." He put Ragna to work. She brushed the mortar into each joint with a flat stick, while Odmund pressed the tiles together, and Torgrim watched from the edge of the pit with his arms folded, saying nothing unless the work was wrong, and then saying only one word: "Again." They tested each section with cold smoke from a bundle of damp punk wood before moving on. If smoke seeped from a joint, they broke it open, cleaned it, remortared, and tested again. Ragna learned to read the smoke, to watch for the thin curl that meant a pinhole leak, the wider drift that meant a failed seal. She was 9 years old and her hands were gray with mortar, and she did not complain. The third teaching was the most important. Odmund wanted to pack dirt tight around the pipe to hold it in place. Torgrim stopped him. "Loose stones," Torgrim said. "River cobbles, fist-sized, packed around the pipe so the clay touches stone on every side. The stones absorb heat from the pipe. The air gaps between the stones let heat circulate. Dirt traps moisture. Stone stores heat. That is the difference between a floor that warms and a floor that rots. Above the stones, flat capstones and tamped clay, spreading heat evenly without allowing the floorboards to contact the hot pipe directly. Hot iron under dry pine is a funeral," Torgrim said. 2 inches of stone and clay between the pipe and the boards. Not 1, 2. And if I find you have laid wood against warm clay, I will tear it out myself." Setbacks came in sequence, as setbacks do. The rainstorm that had already collapsed one trench wall came again, harder, and flooded the east end of the pit. 3 tile sections sat in 4 inches of muddy water, and the mortar on 2 joints had to be chipped out and redone after drying. Nels's oldest boys cornered Peter at the schoolhouse and told him his father was digging a grave for the whole family. Peter threw a stone. It missed. The teacher, Miss Elva Morrow, sent Peter home with a note. Odmund read the note and said nothing. Peter said, They said you are building a hole to die in. Oddman looked at his son and said, I am building a floor to live on. But Peter's eyes were the eyes of a child who has heard too many adults say otherwise. Then the first smoke test failed. They had sealed 30 of the 32 tile sections and all 6 elbow boxes. Torgrim approved the mortar. The bypass damper was installed, a flat iron plate that slid in a groove Oddman had filed into the pipe collar. The vertical chimney was extended to 8 feet above the stove, not yet at full height, but enough to test draft. Torgrim lit a small fire in the stove, opened the bypass, let the chimney warm for 12 minutes, then closed the bypass halfway to send smoke into the buried run. The smoke entered the floor. It traveled through the first straight section. It reached the first elbow box, and there it stopped. Smoke seeped from the second elbow box and rolled across the floor in a slow gray wave that reached the children's feet before Oddman could shout. Peter coughed. Ragna pulled him to the door. Torgrim opened the bypass full, and the smoke reversed, climbing the straight pipe again, but the room was hazy and bitter, and Peter's eyes were streaming. Hiram Voss arrived 10 minutes later. He had been riding the road and saw smoke coming from under the cabin door instead of the chimney. Bell was with him. They had been discussing road tax assessments, and Bell stood behind Hiram with the expression of a man who has been proven right and wants everyone in the room to know it. I have seen men die from less smoke than that, Hiram said. His voice was flat, not gloating, genuine concern wrapped in genuine anger. Open the door, open the damper, get those children out. The children are out, Oddman said. Ragna had taken Peter to the shed. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. The room stank of smoke and failure. Bell stepped forward. He looked at the pit, the pipe, the mortar, the stones that were half filled and half bare, and the haze still curling near the floor. Now he has built the grave inside the house, Bell said. Just as I said he would. Torgrim did not look at Bell. He was already on his knees at the second elbow box, scraping mortar with a chisel. He found the failure, a hairline crack in the brick where the elbow joined the straight tile, invisible until smoke under pressure found it and opened it into a mouth. The brick is bad, Torgrim said. We need to rebuild this elbow. With what? Oddman said. Bell will not sell me brick. Then we find brick. They found brick. 3 miles east, an abandoned sod house had a chimney base built from 14 bricks that no one had claimed. Oddman and Torgrim pulled them in a handcart through frozen mud. 7 of the 14 were sound. They rebuilt the failed elbow that night by lantern light, with Ragna holding the lamp and Torgrim pressing each joint while Oddman mixed mortar in a tin basin that had been Marte's wash basin. Ragna had given it up without being asked. She had seen the basin on the shelf, seen that it was the right shape for mixing, and placed it on the floor beside her father's knee. Oddman looked at the basin and then at his daughter, and understood that the cost of this floor was being paid in ways he could not measure. Torgrim watched Oddman seal the last joint of the rebuilt elbow. He pressed it. He struck it with his knuckle. He nodded once. Again, he said. But this time the word meant something different. It meant, we test again. Not because the work was wrong, because the work had to be proven right. Unexpected help arrived the next morning. Nels Bredesen pulled up in a farm wagon loaded with 2 heaps of riverstone, cobbles the size of a man's fist, pulled from the James River bar where Nels's boys watered the horses. The stones were cold and wet and covered in silt. There were enough to fill a quarter of the remaining stone bed. Nels did not get down from the wagon. He set the brake and looked at Oddman and said, Peter apologized to my boys yesterday. He walked 2 miles to do it. A 5-year-old should not have to walk 2 miles because grown men cannot keep their mouths shut. Oddman said, I cannot pay you for the stone. I did not ask for payment. I asked for my boys to stop repeating what they hear at the store. Nels looked at the cabin, at the open door where Torgrim was testing the repaired elbow with a candle flame. I still think your floor will fill with smoke, but children should not pay for grown men's pride. He unloaded the stone himself, stacking it in a pile by the south wall. Then he drove away without looking back. Oddman stood beside the pile and did the math. 2 wagon loads. Perhaps 1,800 pounds. He needed another 6,000. But 1,800 was 1,800 more than he had the day before, and on the Dakota Prairie, math that moved in your direction was math worth remembering. Progress markers. Tightening. Stone bed half filled by December 2nd. Clay run sealed by November 26th. Every joint tested with cold smoke, every joint holding. Bypass damper functioning. Vertical chimney extended to full height, 12 feet above the stove collar, kept inside the cabin wall for the first 8 feet, emerging through a tin collar that Torgrim sealed with clay and horsehair, and that Oddman checked every morning by holding a lit match below it and watching the flame pull upward. The calendar said 6 weeks had passed. The ground was frozen. The cottonwood pile was down to 3/4 of a cord. The children ate oats and salt pork and dried beans, and Ragna had stopped asking when they would have bread because the answer was always the same. When the floor works and the stove can burn less wood, and the money that would have gone to fuel can go to flour instead. The floor was not yet finished, but the system was built. Torgrim insisted on 3 test burns before any child slept inside the cabin with the buried run active. The first burn came on December 4th. Morning, air temperature near the floor, 38 degrees. Oddman opened the bypass and lit dry kindling in the stove. The fire caught. The chimney warmed. After 10 minutes, he closed the bypass halfway. Smoke hesitated at the entrance to the buried run, a held breath, then pulled downward and into the clay channel. No seepage. No haze. The smoke traveled underground. 28 minutes later, the far clean-out, the iron lid at the last elbow before the vertical chimney, grew warm under Oddman's palm. An hour after that, the floor stones near the center of the run radiated heat he could feel through the relayed boards. By the end of the second hour, the room had climbed from 38 degrees to 56. The stove was barely warm, the floor was alive, not enough heat, not yet, but proof of movement, proof that the physics worked, that his mother's lesson survived the translation from limestone to river cobble, from Wisconsin kitchen to Dakota claim shack. The second burn was stronger. Oddman loaded the stove with dry cottonwood and let it run hard for 90 minutes with the bypass closed. Torgrim had given him a dairy thermometer borrowed from a farmer in Miller, and they placed it on the floor at the center of the run and watched. The needle climbed. Floor surface near the pipe, 92 degrees. Floor surface at the room's center, 71. Room air at chest height, 64 degrees. 4 hours after the flame died and the stove went cold. Torgrim sat on the floor and placed both palms flat on the boards. He closed his eyes. Then he opened them and looked at Oddman and said, "Do not chase numbers. Too hot is as dangerous as too cold. Pine over hot clay is not patient forever." The third burn was a night test. Oddman fired the stove at 8 in the evening, ran the burn for 2 hours, closed the damper, and let the stone bed work. At 6 the next morning, the floor still held warmth. Not the 92 degrees of the peak. The stones had cooled to 60 near the center and 50 near the walls. But the room had never dropped below 48 overnight. The previous night, without the buried run, the room had been at 31 by dawn. The difference was 17 degrees. 17 degrees was the difference between a cup of water freezing and a cup of water staying liquid. 17 degrees was the distance between a child waking with frost on her blanket and a child waking with warm feet. But the skeptics were not finished. Hiram rode past, and Oddman invited him to feel the floor. Hiram placed his palm on the boards, held it for 10 seconds, and said, "Mild weather tests nothing. When the wind comes from the northwest at 40 miles an hour and the chimney moans like something dying, your draft will reverse and the stones will cool in an hour. This is a mild weather trick." Nels came to inspect and said, "I feel the warmth. I also feel the risk. One bad joint, one soot blockage, and the next warm thing in this room will be the children's fever." Bell did not come at all. He sent his opinion through the store counter. "The first real storm will show Stensland what a chimney is for." Torgrim's cough worsened through the first week of December. He slept in the lean-to with a blanket over his chest, and Odman heard him through the wall at night. The wet, deep sound of lungs that had spent 30 years breathing kiln dust and lime powder and smoke from 100 different chimneys in 100 different towns. He did not complain. He worked through the mornings and rested through the afternoons, and by evening he was on his feet again, checking joints, testing the bypass, teaching Ragna to read the flame. On December 10th, Torgrim told Odmund he would leave after Christmas. His next job was in Huron, a bake oven for a German family, and the freight wagon would come through Miller on December 28th. "You are ready," Torgrim said. "You know the system. You know the joints. You know the bypass. What if something fails that I have not seen fail?" Torgrim looked at him across the stove. The lantern threw their shadows against the sod wall. "Something will fail. Something always fails. When the smoke slows, do not add wood. Open the throat. Let it breathe. A chimney that cannot exhale will choke, and a man who panics will feed the choking instead of clearing it." He said it once. He did not repeat it. Odmund heard it the way a man hears a sentence he knows he will need later. Not yet, not tonight, but soon, and in conditions that would test whether he had truly listened or merely heard. Torgrim left on December 29th, riding the freight wagon north with his tool bag between his knees and his cough worse than it had been when he arrived. He shook Odmund's hand at the road and said, "The floor is good. The mason is better." Then he said, "Tell your daughter she has steadier hands than most men I have worked with." And then the wagon turned the corner, and Odmund stood on the frozen road and watched the man who had saved his winter disappear into a country that did not care whether either of them survived it. The cabin was warm that night. The stones held the evening's fire. The children slept on quilts over boards that breathed heat upward in the dark. And Odmund lay awake and listened to the silence where Torgrim's cough had been, and felt the particular weight of being alone with knowledge he had not yet been forced to prove. January 12, 1888, began with a lie. The morning was mild, strangely, unnaturally mild for Dakota in January, the kind of warmth that made men unbutton their coats, and women open kitchen windows, and children run to school without scarves. The air felt like late March. The sky was high and pale. The wind, which had blown from the northwest for 3 straight weeks, shifted south and carried something that smelled almost like thaw. Odmund considered a heavy firing to bank the stone bed with heat. Then he looked at the woodpile, down to half a cord, carefully rationed, and decided to save the fuel. The air was soft. The children could walk to school in comfort. He would fire the stove that evening when the cold returned. Ragna and Peter left at 8 in the morning for the schoolhouse 2 miles south. Peter wore his coat unbuttoned. Ragna carried her lunch pail in one hand and her slate in the other, and walked with the unhurried stride of a child who does not know what is coming. Odmund split wood. He patched the south wall. He cleaned the second clean-out pocket. Soot had built to a 1/4 inch along the elbow floor, and he scraped it with a bent spoon into a tin can. Routine work, calm work. The kind of work a man does when he believes the day is ordinary. By early afternoon, the sky changed. It did not darken gradually the way storm skies usually darkened on the prairie. It came like a wall. The northwest horizon turned the color of a bruise, gray-green, dense, rolling, and the temperature dropped so fast that Odmund felt it in his teeth before he felt it on his skin. The wind hit like something thrown. It came from the northwest with the full weight of 1,000 miles of open plain behind it, and it carried snow so fine and so dense that the world beyond the cabin wall ceased to exist in the span of 10 breaths. The children's blizzard of January 12, 1888. Odmund's first thought was the stove. His second thought was the children. The stove was cold. The children were 2 miles away in a schoolhouse with a single stovepipe and a door that opened outward against the wind. He fired the stove. He did not waste time with the bypass. Straight up the chimney, hot and fast. Get the firebox roaring. Then he pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf over his face and opened the cabin door and walked into a world that had stopped being visible. The wind was not wind. It was a physical force that pushed him sideways and filled his mouth with ice crystals that tasted like metal. He could not see the woodpile 10 feet from the door. He could not see the lean-to. He could not see the road. He walked by memory, counting steps, his hand outstretched to catch the fence wire before he passed it. He found the road by falling into the frozen ruts. He turned south. He walked. The temperature was still dropping, not steadily but in lurches, as though the atmosphere were descending a staircase, each step colder than the last. He could feel it in his lungs. He could feel it in his fingers. He could feel it pulling the warmth from his body through every layer of wool and cotton. He heard Peter's cough between gusts. Not close. Not where Peter should have been if the teacher had kept the children inside. Out on the open road, less than half a mile from the schoolhouse, moving in the wrong direction. He found them in a cluster. Miss Elva Morrow, the schoolteacher, 26 years old, from Iowa, holding the hands of 2 children and walking blind. 6 children followed in a chain behind her, each gripping the coat of the child ahead. Peter was at the end of the chain. Ragna was beside him, her arm locked through his, her face white with cold. Nels's youngest boy, 8 years old, was crying without sound. A hired girl of perhaps 15 walked at the back with her hands hanging at her sides, and her fingers were the color of candle wax. Miss Morrow had tried to lead them to the nearest homestead. She had missed the turn. They were walking north, deeper onto the open prairie, away from every shelter within 2 miles. "How many?" Oddman shouted over the wind. 9, Miss Morrow shouted back. "I cannot feel the road." Oddman grabbed the rope at the front of the chain and turned them. He pulled. His shoulder, his left, the one he had wrenched dragging the handcart through ruts in November, tore something inside when the chain of children resisted the wind. He felt the pull like a hot wire running from his collarbone to his elbow. He did not stop. He pulled them south and east, counting fence posts by touch, until his hand found the gate wire of his own property. 9 people came through his cabin door. His 2 children, Miss Morrow, Nels's youngest, 3 other school children whose names he knew but whose parents he could not reach, the hired girl, whose hands were waxy and stiff, and who did not speak. The cabin was barely warm. The stove had been burning for less than 20 minutes on a straight chimney, and the stone bed below the floor was cold. He had not run the buried system since the morning, when the day had seemed too mild to waste fuel. The buried heater now faced its real test. Not a mild weather demonstration for skeptics. Not a controlled burn with a borrowed thermometer. 9 people, 6 of them children, in a room 14 feet by 18 feet, with a blizzard outside that was killing everything it touched, and a heating system that had never operated under storm conditions. Oddman closed the door. The wind screamed against it. He looked at the stove and the bypass damper, and the floor beneath which 48 feet of clay pipe lay cold in 9,000 pounds of cold stone. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because this is the moment every warning against Oddman's floor seems to come true. He opened the bypass full. He fed dry kindling into the stove, fast, building a hot core. The chimney was still warm from the quick fire he had lit before leaving. The flame leaned toward the pipe. The draft held. He waited. 10 minutes. The pipe above the stove radiated heat. The chimney was pulling. He closed the bypass halfway. Smoke hesitated at the mouth of the buried run. The clay was cold. The stones were cold. The system resisted. For 5 seconds. 5 seconds that felt like 5 minutes. The smoke sat in the pipe collar and did not move. Then it pulled. The warm chimney above drew the exhaust through the cold channel, and the smoke began its 48-foot journey through the stone bed. 2 minutes later, smoke puffed from the first clean-out lid. Ragna saw it. Her eyes went to Oddman's face. The hired girl coughed. One of the younger children whimpered. Miss Morrow moved the children away from the clean-out, pressing them toward the center of the room. Belle's voice came back in the haze. "That chimney will remember the sky only after your children stop breathing." Oddman's hands were on the bypass. Every instinct said add wood, feed the fire, force the smoke through. But Torgrim's voice was louder than instinct and clearer, and it said the opposite. When the smoke slows, do not add wood. Open the throat. Let it breathe. Oddmund opened the bypass. He let the chimney breathe. He let the draft recover. He did not force. He did not feed. He waited. The smoke line at the first clean-out thinned. Then it stopped. The draft in the vertical chimney strengthened as the hot exhaust from the bypass heated the column. After 3 minutes, he closed the bypass again, slowly, an inch at a time, and the smoke entered the buried run, and this time it did not hesitate. The warm chimney pulled. The smoke followed. The first clean-out stayed sealed. The far clean-out grew warm after 20 minutes. The stones were taking heat. For the next 11 hours, Oddmund Stensland fed his stove the way Torgrim had taught him. Short, hot burns of dry wood, never smoldering, never loading the firebox full. 1 armload every 4 to 5 hours. Between burns, the stone bed held what the fire had given it and pushed the warmth upward through the floorboards. The children sat on quilts laid over the warmest section of floor, the center of the serpentine run, where the pipe passed closest to the surface. Miss Morrow rubbed the hired girl's hands between her own, pressing circulation back into the waxy fingers. Peter fell asleep on the warm boards and did not stir. Every hour, Oddmund checked the cleanouts with a candle flame. He held the candle near each iron lid and watched. A steady flame meant no leakage. A flickering flame meant draft pulling through the lid seal, acceptable, expected. A flame that bent away from the lid meant smoke escaping, and smoke escaping meant a joint failure somewhere in the buried run. The flames held steady. Every hour, every lid. The system breathed. By midnight, the cabin held at 70 degrees near the center of the floor and 62 near the walls. The stove itself was barely warm between burns, a dull iron box with banked coals, giving off less heat than a man's body. But the floor was alive. The stones beneath the boards had absorbed 12 hours of exhaust heat and were releasing it upward in a slow, steady wave that warmed the air from below. Miss Morrow sat on the floor and pressed her palm flat against the boards. She held it there for 10 seconds. Then she looked up at Oddmund. "The floor is warmer than the stove," she said. "That is the idea," Oddmund said. He did not smile. There was no room for satisfaction while the wind outside was still killing. The wind did not stop. The temperature did not rise. The blizzard held through the night and into the pre-dawn hours with the relentless patience of a thing that does not tire. Outside, the world was white noise and zero visibility and cold that killed livestock standing in their stalls. At dawn, someone pounded on the door. Hiram Voss stood on the step, barely standing. His face was gray. His hands were inside his coat, pressed against his body. His road-shed stove had gone out after the pipe clogged with wind-driven snow, and he had crawled the last 400 yards on his hands and knees, following the fence wire to Oddmund's gate. Oddmund pulled him inside. The children made room. Hiram collapsed on the warm floor and lay there without speaking for 10 minutes, his body slowly unclenching as the heat from the stones below reached through the boards and into his frozen coat. 20 minutes later, Nels's wife arrived with a child under each arm, Nels's youngest and a neighbor's girl, wrapped in a horse blanket. Their cabin's corner had frozen solid, the wall gap letting wind through faster than the stove could fight it. She had walked a quarter-mile in whiteout because she knew Oddmund's place was close, and because she had heard, though she had not believed, that his floor was warm. 12 people in a room built for 4. The stove burned low. The floor held. Not everyone survived the storm. Alva Crane, a hired man on a claim 3 miles west, died in a haystack after losing the road. They found him in the spring, curled around a feed sack, his hand still gripping the straw. He was 23. He had come from Ohio 8 months before and had told people at the store he would go back east in the spring. The spring came, and he was still in the haystack, and no one went back east for him. His death kept the morning after the storm from feeling like victory. Oddmund did not celebrate. He fed the stove. He checked the cleanouts. He gave Miss Morrow the last of the dried beans for the children's breakfast. Ragna warmed water on the stove for the hired girl's hands, which had regained color through the night, but were blistered and swollen. The wind died before noon. The survivors stepped outside into a world scoured clean, drifts 5 feet high against the south walls, silence so complete that Peter said, "Where did the noise go?" Hiram Voss was the last to leave. He had spent the night on the warm floor, and when he rose he stood for a long moment looking at the boards beneath his feet. He crouched. He placed his palm flat on the floor, the same gesture he had used in October to find frost on the far wall. This time the boards were warm, not hot, not uncomfortable, the steady, even warmth of mass that had been fed and had remembered. He stood up. He looked at Oddmund. He said nothing. He walked out the door and into the white morning and did not look back. But the silence was louder than anything Hiram had ever said, and Oddmund heard it clearly. The survivors did not wake around the stove. They woke on the floor. That single image, 12 people rising from quilts spread across warm boards while the stove sat cold and dull on its iron legs, said everything that argument could not. The fire had died at 4 in the morning. No one had fed it. The stones beneath the floor had held their heat through the remaining hours of the storm, and when the children opened their eyes at dawn, they opened them in a room that was 58 degrees without a flame burning anywhere. Miss Morrow noticed first. She had slept near the center of the room, where the serpentine run passed closest to the surface, and she sat up and placed her hand on the boards, the way a person touches something they do not trust. The boards were warm. She looked at the stove, iron gray, no glow, no sound. She looked at the floor. She pressed harder. "The stove is out," she said. "It has been out for 3 hours," Oddmund said. He was sitting by the door where he had spent the last hour listening to the wind die. "Then what is heating the floor?" "Yesterday's fire." The next 3 days unfolded in the way that news moves on the prairie. Not through announcement, but through bodies arriving at a doorstep. Hiram Voss came back first. He had gone home after the storm broke, slept 12 hours in his road shed, which he had relit and which had cooled to 31 degrees by the time he woke, and then ridden straight to Oddmund's cabin. He did not bring a gift. He did not bring an apology. He brought a question. "Show me the clean-outs," he said. Oddmund lifted the iron lid nearest the stove. Hiram crouched and looked into the channel, a dark tunnel of clay and soot, with the faint warmth of residual heat rising from the stone bed below. He put his face close enough to feel the air moving. The draft was gentle but steady, pulling toward the vertical chimney at the far end. He stood up. He moved to the second clean-out. He lifted the lid and looked again, then the third, then the fourth. At each one, he placed his palm on the floor beside the lid and held it for 10 seconds, feeling the heat that the stones were still releasing into the boards above. Then he stood at the center of the room and looked at Oddmund. "I was right about smoke killing a man," Hiram said. "I've seen it happen, and I will not take those words back. A buried flue without proper draft and proper joints will fill a house with poison, and any man who tells you different is selling something." Oddmund said nothing. "I was wrong," Hiram said, "that you had built only smoke." He let the words settle. They were not easy words for a man like Hiram, a man whose authority came from experience, whose experience came from survival, and whose survival had taught him that the methods he knew were the only methods that worked. To admit error was to admit that the prairie could still teach him something, and at 59 that admission cost more than most people understood. "The schoolhouse stove nearly killed those children," Hiram said. "The pipe is too short. The draft is poor. The damper has not been cleaned since the building went up. I want you to inspect it before classes start again." It was not a request dressed as conversation. It was the first acknowledgement from the authority who had told Oddmund to abandon his claim that Oddmund knew something worth consulting. Nels Bredesen came on the second day after the storm. He came without his sons and without his wagon. He walked. He stood in Oddmund's doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "My wife told me the floor was warm. I did not believe her. She said I should come feel it myself before I said another word about smoke and dead children. Odmund opened the door. Nels entered the cabin and knelt. He placed both palms flat on the floor, the way Hiram had, and held them there. His face changed, not dramatically, not with revelation, but with the slow adjustment of a man recalibrating something he had been certain about. "How much wood did you burn through the storm?" Nels asked. "Less than a third of a cord. After the stone bed reached temperature, 1 armload every 4 to 5 hours kept it fed." Nels stood up. "I burned nearly a full cord. My stove ran all night and all day, and the north wall was still frozen solid. My wife slept in her coat with the children on top of her." He walked the room. He examined the bypass damper. He asked how the cleanouts worked. He asked about the slope of the pipe. He asked about the mortar. What was in it? How thick? How it held against heat cycling? He asked questions the way a man asks who intends to build, not the way a man asks who intends to argue. "Can you build one smaller?" Nels said. "I do not have the room to tear up my whole floor, but one room, the room where the children sleep." "I can show you how," Odmund said. "But I will not touch a joint I have not tested, and you will let me test every joint before you close the floor." Nels put his hat back on. "I would not have it otherwise," he said. It was not an apology for the words at Bell's dock. It was something more useful, the conversion of doubt into collaboration. Nels had been wrong, and instead of pretending he had not been, he brought his wrongness to the table and asked what to do with it. Within a week, 5 homesteaders had come to see the floor. Each visit followed the same pattern: suspicion at the door, silence on the boards, questions that started skeptical and ended practical. Odmund showed every one of them the cleanouts, the bypass damper, the mortar joints. He opened the iron lids and let them see the channel. He showed them the soot, a thin film, manageable, and the tool he used to scrape it. He answered every question with specifics: 1 inch per 8 feet of rise, clay lime sand ash horsehair mortar, 2 inches of stone and clay between pipe and board, never run a cold horizontal flue without warming the chimney first, never lay iron against dry wood, never seal a cleanout so tight that it cannot be opened with one hand. He did not charge. He refused payment 3 times in the first week, once in cash, once in pork, once in a bolt of cotton that he wanted badly enough to taste it. He refused because charging for survival knowledge felt like selling water during a drought. The knowledge was not his alone. It was Torgrim's and his mother's and his grandfather's, and it belonged to the physics of stone and heat, and you did not own physics any more than you owned the wind. But he insisted on safety rules. He wrote them on a board and nailed the board to the inside of his cabin door. Warm the chimney before closing the bypass. Seal every joint with proper mortar. Keep cleanouts accessible. Never bury iron pipe directly against wood. Never run a cold horizontal flue without draft. Test with cold smoke before hot. If smoke leaks, do not add wood. Open the throat and let it breathe. Miss Morrow copied the rules onto slate and brought the slate to the schoolhouse. She set it beside the door where every parent could read it when they came to collect their children. It was the beginning of something Odmund did not yet have a word for: the transformation of one man's desperate gamble into a community's shared knowledge. Bell's reaction came in 2 stages, and both stages were exactly what a man like Bell would choose. First, he tried to stop it. He appeared at the store counter and told anyone who would listen that the buried flue was unsafe, that the storm survival was luck, that one good season did not prove a method, and that the county should prohibit underground smoke channels before someone's children died for real. He said it with the moral certainty of a man who had never built anything but who understood that authority in a small community belonged to whoever spoke loudest at the counter. No one listened. They had felt the floor. They had seen the children wake on warm boards while the stove sat cold. They had burned through their own wood piles while Odmund's held. Bell's words landed on ground that had already shifted, so Bell tried the second approach. Within 2 weeks, he was selling what he called Stensland floor pipe kits, cracked clay drain tile from the remaining lot behind his freight shed, bundled with a sack of cheap lime and a pamphlet of instructions that Bell had written himself. The price was triple what Odmund had paid for the same tile. The instructions did not mention the bypass damper. They did not mention mortar composition. They did not mention the 2-inch clearance between pipe and wood. They mentioned only the arrangement of pipe under a floor, the part that looked simple because it was the part that was visible. Odmund heard about the kits from Nels, who heard about them from the liveryman who had bought one and was planning to install it the following weekend. The system that could save a family could also kill one, and Bell was selling the killing version at a profit. Torgrim Assen had not gone to Huron. The freight wagon that was supposed to carry him north on December 29th had been delayed by ice on the road, and then delayed again by a broken axle, and then delayed a third time by the German family in Huron, writing to say the bake oven project was postponed until April. Torgrim had spent January in Miller, sleeping in the back of the livery stable, repairing chimneys for anyone who would pay, and coughing into a rag that he folded carefully so no one could see what color it was. He returned to Odmund's claim on January 18th, 6 days after the blizzard. He walked through the door and looked at the floor and said nothing for a long time. Then he sat down on the boards, placed both palms flat, and closed his eyes. "You remembered the rule," Torgrim said. "The smoke puffed from the first clean-out. I nearly added wood." "But you did not." "I did not." Torgrim opened his eyes. "Show me the joints." They spent the afternoon inspecting every accessible section of the system. Torgrim checked the clean-out pockets, scraped soot from the first elbow, tested the bypass mechanism, and examined the mortar along the exposed top edge of the channel where the floorboards met the clay cap. He found 2 hairline cracks, one near the third clean-out, one along the straight section beneath the north wall. Neither was leaking. Both would leak eventually. "Fix them now," Torgrim said. "Do not wait for the smoke to tell you." They mixed mortar. They sealed the cracks. And then Torgrim did something he had not done before. He sat beside the stove and talked about the past. He told Odmund about the first kiln he had built in Lanesboro, Minnesota, in 1862. A lime kiln for a farmer named Arne Grindheim, who wanted to make his own mortar instead of buying it from the county seat. The kiln had cracked on its third firing because Torgrim had used river clay without enough sand, and the thermal expansion had split the wall like a log under a wedge. Grindheim had not fired him. He had said, "Now you know what clay does when it is angry. Build it again." Torgrim told Odmund about the bread oven in Fergus Falls that he considered his finest work, a double-walled stone chamber with a flue path that wound through the masonry and exited through a stack so efficient that the baker could fire it once in the morning and bake 6 batches of bread on the residual heat. He told him about the tile stove in a Norwegian church in Decorah, Iowa, a tall ceramic structure with internal baffles that heated the sanctuary with 1 load of wood while the adjacent Methodist church burned 3 loads and was still cold during the sermon. And he told Odmund about his hands. He held them up in the lantern light, thick, scarred, the knuckles swollen, the fingertips cracked and dark with permanent lime stain. "These hands have built 47 chimneys, 11 kilns, 9 bread ovens, and 1 tile stove that a church in Iowa still uses," Torgrim said. "They have also built 3 chimneys that failed and 1 kiln that nearly killed the man who lit it. A mason who tells you he has never built a failure is a mason who has not built enough to learn." Odmund looked at his own hands, younger, thinner, cracked from the spade and stained with clay. "Torgrim, stay through the winter." Torgrim coughed. The sound was deeper than it had been in November. "I will stay until you do not need me to stay. That is a different thing." They worked together through the last weeks of January and into February. The collaboration had changed. In November, Torgrim had been the teacher and Odmund the student. Now they were closer to partners, unequal in experience, but equal in purpose. Torgrim deferred to Odmund's knowledge of the specific system, the specific stone bed, the specific draft behavior that only the man who slept above it every night could know. Odmund deferred to Torgrim's knowledge of materials, of heat behavior in masonry, of the 100 small failures that 30 years of building had taught him to anticipate. They designed a safer version for the schoolhouse together. Not a full buried stone bed, The schoolhouse floor was too high off the ground and the crawl space too shallow, but a brick heat-retaining channel behind the stove, running horizontally for 8 feet before turning upward into a proper vertical chimney. Larger clean-outs, a brick bell chamber at the base of the chimney to slow the exhaust and extract additional heat. No wooden sleepers touching the hot masonry, every joint visible and accessible. Torgrim drew the plan on a board with charcoal, while Oddmund corrected the dimensions to match the schoolhouse's frame. They argued about the bell chamber. Torgrim wanted it wider, Oddmund wanted it taller, and the argument lasted an hour and ended with Torgrim saying, "Build it your way. Then when it drafts poorly, rebuild it mine." Oddmund built it Torgrim's way. It drafted well. Ragna learned to mark pipe slope with a water tube, a length of glass tubing half filled with water, held against the tile run, showing by the bubble whether the rise was correct. Torgrim taught her the technique and then made her teach it back to him while he pretended not to understand. She corrected his deliberately wrong placement 3 times before she realized he was testing her, and when she realized it, she did not laugh. She said, "You are worse than my father." Torgrim said, "Your father is worse than my kiln." Nels learned to smoke test joints. He came to Oddmund's cabin twice a week and practiced with damp punk wood and a candle, reading the flame for leakage, scraping and resealing joints that Oddmund had deliberately loosened to give him something to find. Miss Morrow copied the safety rules onto fresh slate and hung them inside the schoolhouse door. She added rules of her own: what to do if smoke enters the room during a storm, how to open a bypass damper if it sticks, who to send for if a clean-out will not open. She wrote them in the clear, practical language of a woman who had stood in a room full of smoke with 6 children and understood that the difference between survival and death was not courage, but procedure. Torgrim died on the 14th of March, 1888, not during a storm, not in the act of saving anyone, not in any way that the story would have chosen if stories could choose their own shapes. He died of pneumonia in the lean-to behind Oddmund's cabin, after 3 weeks of a cough that had moved from his chest to his lungs to the space behind his ribs where breathing lived. He had known. Oddmund understood that later. That Torgrim had known since January, maybe since November, that the cough was not the kind of cough that went away. 30 years of kiln dust and lime powder and smoke from 100 different fires had built something in his lungs that winter could not clean and spring would not cure. He did not say this to Oddmund. He said it to no one. He worked. In his last week, Torgrim made Oddmund rebuild the 3rd elbow box alone. The box was sound. The joints were solid. The mortar had held through 2 months of firing, and the thermal cycling had not cracked a single seam. There was no reason to rebuild it. But Torgrim said, "Take it apart. Rebuild it. I will watch." Oddmund took it apart. He chipped out the mortar, separated the brick, cleaned the clay faces, and rebuilt the elbow from the ground up while Torgrim sat on a stool beside the pit and watched with his hands folded on his knees. The first rebuild, Torgrim said, again. The mortar was good. The alignment was true. The joints were tight. But Torgrim said, again. Oddmund took it apart and rebuilt it a 3rd time. His hands knew the work now. The brick sat where his fingers placed it. The mortar filled the joint without excess. The elbow fit the straight tile sections with a precision that required no shim and no correction. Torgrim looked at the 3rd rebuild and said nothing. He placed his hand on the elbow and held it there. Then he stood up slowly and walked to the lean-to and lay down on his blanket and did not come back out. Oddmund found him the next morning. He had died in the early hours, quietly, without calling for help. His tool bag was packed. His mason's line was coiled and placed on top of the bag. His hands were folded on his chest, and on the left thumb there was a smear of dried clay that Oddmund recognized. It was from the 3rd elbow rebuild, from the moment Torgrim had pressed his hand against the finished joint. Oddmund buried Torgrim Asen on the high ground west of the cabin, where the drainage was good and the wind kept the snow thin. He marked the grave with a stone from the river, a flat stone the size of a dinner plate, smooth and heavy, the kind of stone that holds heat. He hung the mason's line above the stove, coiled on a nail, where the rising warmth would keep it dry. The cabin was quiet that night, in a way it had not been quiet before. The stones still held heat. The children still slept on warm boards. The system Torgrim had helped build still breathed. But the man who had crouched at the edge of the pit and said, "Heat will go where pressure sends it," was gone, and the heat went on without him, and that was the measure of what he had built, that it outlasted the builder. Spring came to Han County the way spring comes to the Dakota prairie, not gently, but through violence. Snow melted in sheets. Creeks jumped their banks. The James River rose 3 feet in 2 days. And Nels Bredeson's partially built floor channel, which Oddman had begun helping him construct in February, filled with meltwater that seeped through the foundation seams and pooled in the stone bed. Oddman arrived at Nels's cabin to find 6 inches of muddy water sitting in the crawl space around the clay tile. The mortar was intact. They had used Torgrim's mix and it held against water as well as it held against smoke. But the stones were soaked, and wet stones would steal heat instead of storing it. Worse, the low cleanout pockets had become drains, pulling water into the channel itself. And if a fire were lit with water in the system, steam would build in the sealed tile and find any weak point in the mortar with the certainty of a thing that has nowhere else to go. Nels looked at the flooded crawl space and then at Oddman and said, "This is what Bell will say killed the idea." "This is what I am going to fix," Oddman said. He redesigned Nels's system over 2 days, working from Torgrim's principles but extending them into territory Torgrim had never mapped. A raised manifold, the stone bed lifted 6 inches above the crawlspace floor on a base of flat rock and tamped clay, so water could pass beneath without touching the tile. A drainage trench dug from the crawlspace to a daylight outlet on the downhill side of the cabin, carrying meltwater away from the heated mass. Cleanout pockets raised to match the new bed height, with clay lips that would shed water instead of collecting it. It was not Torgrim's design, it was Oddman's. Built on Torgrim's principles, tested against a problem Torgrim had not encountered, solved by a man who understood the physics well enough to adapt them to new ground. Oddman had moved from copying to comprehension, and the proof was in the drainage trench that Torgrim had never drawn. Bell's cracked tile reached 2 families before Oddman found out. The first family, the Halversons, a young couple with an infant, had bought Bell's kit and laid pipe under their sleeping room according to Bell's pamphlet. They had not built a bypass damper because the pamphlet did not mention one. They had not used horsehair mortar because the pamphlet called for plain mud. They had laid tile flat without slope because the pamphlet said nothing about rise. Their first smoke test filled the room in 90 seconds. The baby coughed until it vomited. Mrs. Halverson carried the child outside into cold rain and stood in the mud and screamed at her husband that he had tried to kill their son. Oddman heard about it from Miss Morrow, who had heard it from the Halverson woman at the store. He went to their cabin the same day. He found the tile run, short, flat, unsealed, connected to a cold chimney with no bypass and no cleanouts. It was everything Nels had predicted and everything Torgrim had spent weeks teaching Oddman to prevent. He tore it out. The Halversons watched him pull their floor apart for the second time in a week. He relaid the tile with proper slope, proper mortar, a bypass damper fabricated from a stove lid and a filed groove, and 2 clean-out pockets at the turns. He did not charge them. He charged Bell. He walked into Bell's store the following morning and asked to see the remaining tile lot. Bell, sensing a sale, brought out the cracked sections, 32 tiles stacked behind the counter. Oddman picked up the first tile and struck it with the claw end of a hammer. The sound was dead, a flat, choked thud that did not ring. A tile that would crack under thermal cycling, that would open at the hairline fractures and leak smoke into a sleeping room. He struck the second tile. Dead. The third. Dead. He worked through the entire lot, 32 tiles, striking each one in front of Bell and the 3 men standing at the counter. 26 of the 32 rang dead. The other 6 rang clear, sound tile that would hold. "These 26 will kill someone," Oddman said. He said it to Bell, but he said it for the men at the counter. The cracks are invisible until heat opens them. A family that lays this tile will have smoke in their room by the second firing. You are selling coffins shaped like drain pipe. Belle's face was the color of old ash. You do not have the authority to condemn my merchandise. I have the authority of a floor that held 12 people through the worst storm in Dakota Territory. You have the authority of a store counter. Ask these men which one they trust. The men at the counter said nothing. They did not need to. Their silence was Belle's answer, and Belle heard it the way a man hears a door closing. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the cold comes. Belle did not remove the condemned tile from his store, but he did not sell another kit. The 6 sound tiles sat behind the counter for 3 months before a farmer bought them for a drainage job that had nothing to do with heating. The 26 cracked tiles gathered dust until Belle moved them to the alley behind the store, where rain and frost finished what Oddman's hammer had started. The partnership with Miss Elva Morrow did not begin with courtship. It began with an argument. She came to Oddman's cabin in late February to discuss the schoolhouse modification. The brick heat-retaining channel that Torgrim and Oddman had designed was nearly ready for installation, and Miss Morrow wanted it completed before the next cold spell. But she also wanted something Oddman resisted, a written protocol for sending children home when storm signs appeared. You cannot predict a blizzard, Oddman said. You can read a sky, Miss Morrow said. January 12th was warm all morning, and everyone knew by noon that the warmth was wrong. If I had sent the children home at noon, they would have been in their own cabins when the wind hit. Or on the road between the school and their cabins, alone, without a teacher. Better alone on a road they know than lost on a prairie they cannot see. They argued for 40 minutes. They argued about wind signs and sky color, and the distance between the school and the farthest homestead, and the age at which a child could be trusted to walk a mile alone in deteriorating weather. They argued with the precision of 2 people who had stood in the same room full of smoke with the same children, and who both understood, from that shared extremity, that the details of preparation were not theoretical, but were measured in the breathing of children. Oddman did not win the argument. Miss Morrow did not win the argument. They wrote the protocol together, a set of rules posted beside the safety slate at the schoolhouse door, specifying sky conditions, wind shifts, and temperature drops that would trigger early dismissal. Miss Morrow wrote the rules. Oddman corrected the weather signs. Ragna drew a diagram of the nearest shelters and their distances from the school. The respect that grew between them was built from work, not sentiment. She brought her copied safety sheets to his cabin and asked him to check the technical details. He brought his questions about the schoolhouse chimney to her classroom and asked her to show him where the draft was weakest. They disagreed about ventilation and agreed about clean-out schedules, and shared a concern for the children that neither of them had to explain because both of them had carried those children through snow. By March, the community had noticed. Nels's wife said to Nels, "The teacher spends more time at the Stensland cabin than at the schoolhouse." Nels said, "She's learning to smoke test joints." His wife said, "That is one way to describe it." By early April, the shape of what Oddman had built extended beyond his own cabin and beyond his own floor. 3 families had gathered river stone from the James River Bar on the same Saturday. The Bredesen boys hauling for Nels's second room, the Halversons replacing their failed system with Oddman's corrected design, and a third family, the Espeland brothers, building a brick warming bench along their north wall for drying boots and mittens. Oddman moved between the 3 sites in a single day, checking slope, testing mortar, refusing to approve a joint he could not smoke test. He had not planned to become a teacher. He had planned to survive a winter. But survival had created knowledge, and knowledge had created responsibility, and responsibility had given him something that $22 and a cracked stove could not, a place in the community that was built on competence rather than pity. Ragna walked the sites with him. She carried the water tube and the level and checked the slope of every tile run before Oddman inspected the joints. She was 9 years old, and she was the best draft tester in Hand County because she had spent 3 months on her knees in a pit watching smoke and reading candle flames, and she would not approve a joint she could not verify. Peter carried stones. He was still 5. He still filled his lard pail and carried it in both arms with his chin on the top stone. But now the stones went into other people's floors, and the families whose floors he filled knew his name, and the boy who had been told his father was digging a grave was now helping build warmth into homes that had never had it. Miss Morrow posted the safety rules in every home she visited. She corrected families who had misunderstood the bypass damper. She wrote letters to 2 homesteaders further up the James River Road describing the method and inviting them to come see the schoolhouse installation. She was 26 and practical, and she understood that knowledge which stayed in one cabin was knowledge that would die with the cabin. Odman turned down Bell's offer to brand the system. Bell had come to him in March, after the tile humiliation but before the complete loss of face that was still coming, and suggested a partnership. "Stensland floor heaters," Bell said. "I sell the materials, you endorse the product, we split the profit." Odman said, "This is not a store good. This is survival knowledge. You do not sell a man the right to breathe." Bell left with his jaw tight and his ledger unchanged. He would be back. Men like Bell were always back. The question was not whether he would try again, but what form the next attempt would take. The floor held through the spring thaw. The stones dried. The system waited for the next winter the way a well-built tool waits for the next use, while patient, ready, holding the memory of the heat it had been given. And Odman Stensland, who had buried his chimney under a floor of loose river rocks because a 9-year-old girl told him the floor was colder than the table, stood on the warm boards and felt the weight of a debt he could not repay. To a mother in Wisconsin who had said, "Feel the wall," to a mason from Minnesota who had said, "Again," and to a prairie that had tried to kill him and had taught him instead. By the winter of 1888 to 89, the cabin 12 miles north of Miller was no longer a curiosity. It was a workshop. Odman Stensland had not planned this. He had planned to survive one winter with 2 children and a cracked stove and a floor full of river stones. But survival had a way of growing on the prairie. The way a single fence post becomes a fence line, becomes a property boundary, becomes a life. And by the time the second cold season arrived, the cabin that Bell had called a grave was the place where people came to learn how not to freeze. 6 families had some version of heat storage by that December. The systems varied because the cabins varied and because Odman refused to let anyone copy what they did not understand. 2 families had full buried stone beds, serpentine clay runs beneath their sleeping rooms, modeled on Odman's original design, but adapted to their specific dimensions, their specific crawl space depths, their specific chimney heights. 3 families had brick warming benches, shorter, simpler heat-retaining channels built along a north wall or behind a stove, capturing exhaust heat in masonry mass without the full complexity of an underfloor system. The schoolhouse had its brick channel wall and its bell chamber, and its larger cleanouts. And it was the first public building in Hand County where children could sit on the floor in January without their teeth chattering. Each installation had been inspected by Odman before the first fire. Each one had been smoke tested by Ragna before Odman would approve the joints. Each one carried a copy of the safety rules, Miss Morrow's slate version, or Ragna's written checklist, posted where anyone entering could read them. Warm the chimney first. Test the joints. Clean the turns. Never trust cracked tile. Odman did not charge for his labor. He traded. Lime for instruction. Clay for inspection. Winter food, salt pork, dried beans, flour, for the time spent crawling under other people's floors with a candle and a mortar trowel. He never claimed the idea as his own. In every teaching scene, crouching beside a homesteader's pit, pointing out where the slope needed correction, explaining how the bypass damper worked, he said Torgrim's name. He said it the way a man says the name of someone who gave him something that cannot be returned. He said, "Torgrim Asen taught me that draft comes before heat." He said, "Torgrim would have told you to widen that clean out." He said, "The mortar recipe is not mine. It belongs to a mason from Minnesota who is buried on the hill behind my cabin, and you owe him more than you owe me." He named Torgrim because naming was the only currency that reached beyond the grave. A typical teaching day that second winter unfolded like this. A homesteader would arrive at the cabin in the morning, sometimes alone, sometimes with a wife who had questions her husband had not thought to ask, sometimes with a son old enough to swing a hammer and young enough to believe his father's methods were the only methods. Odmund would start at the stove. He would open the bypass and show them the two positions: straight up for chimney warming, closed for the buried run. He would explain the logic. A cold chimney has no pull, and a channel with no pull is a room full of smoke. Then he would open each clean-out lid and let them look into the channel, a dark tunnel of clay and soot with the faint warmth of residual heat rising from the stone bed. He would show them the soot accumulation and the tool he used to scrape it, a bent spoon welded to a rod, simple enough for any blacksmith to make. He would show them the drainage slope and explain why 1 inch per 8 feet mattered. Too flat and condensation pooled in the elbows, too steep and the smoke rushed through before the stones could steal its heat. Then he would light a small fire and let them feel the floor warm beneath their palms. This was the moment that converted more skeptics than any argument. The feeling of heat rising through wood from invisible stone below, heat from a fire that was already dying, was something no description could replicate. The homesteader's wife would press her hands flat on the boards and hold them there and look up at Odmund with the particular expression of a person realizing that what they had dismissed as madness was in fact a language they did not yet speak. Then the questions would start. How deep do I dig? 2 feet below the joists. Less than 2, and the stones have insufficient mass. More than 2, and you cannot reach the cleanouts. What if my chimney is only 8 feet above the stove? Then build a shorter channel, 20 feet instead of 48, or build a warming bench. Match the run to the draft. A long channel with a short chimney is a smoke trap. What if I cannot find river stone? Dense field stone works, limestone works, sandstone crumbles. Do not use it. Hit the stone with a hammer. If it rings, it holds. If it thuds, it will break under heat. How do I know if the tile is sound? Tap it. Odmund would pick up a tile section and strike it with the claw of a hammer. The ring was clear, a tone that sustained for a full second like a small bell. That is a sound tile. Then he would strike a cracked one from the pile he kept for demonstrations. The thud was dead. No ring, no sustain. A flat choked sound that stopped the moment the hammer lifted. That is a tile that will leak smoke by the second firing. Trust your ears. They are better at this than your eyes. Each question led to the next, and the next led to a calculation, and the calculation led to a decision that Odmund would not make for them. He showed them the method. He showed them the dangers. He made them do the work. He crouched at the edge of their pits the way Torgrim had crouched at the edge of his, saying nothing unless the work was wrong, and then saying only what needed correction. He was becoming the thing Torgrim had called him. Mason. Not a professional mason, not a man who had built 47 chimneys and 11 kilns. A homestead mason, a man who understood heat and stone and pressure and draft well enough to keep people alive, and who understood the limits of his knowledge well enough to refuse work that exceeded them. Bell's final reckoning came in November of 1888, and it came not through Odmund's will, but through the physics of bad mortar and green coal. The store chimney, the same chimney Torgrim had repaired the previous autumn, cracked during an early cold snap. Bell had fired green coal too hard and too fast in a flue that had not been cleaned since Torgrim's work. The mortar between the upper courses, which Bell had patched himself with river mud instead of paying for proper lime, could not flex against the thermal expansion. A crack opened along the south face. Smoke poured into the store through the gap between the chimney stack and the wall. The store filled in 4 minutes. Flour sacks absorbed the stink. Bolts of cotton cloth turned gray. Customers knocked over a display of tinned goods trying to reach the door. Bell stood in the street with his coat pulled over his mouth and watched the smoke pour from his own windows, with the particular horror of a man watching his own arguments turn against him, because the man who had called Odmund's floor a grave was now standing outside a building that his own chimney had poisoned. He could not fix it himself. He had tried. He slathered river mud over the crack, and the mud dried and fell within an hour, because river mud does not bond against a chimney any more than it bonds against a floor channel. He packed the crack with rags, and the rags charred and smoked and made the problem worse. He shut the stove down entirely, and without heat, the store was losing customers by the hour because no one would spend money in a building cold enough to see their own breath. 3 days passed. The store stayed cold. The chimney stayed cracked, and Bell stayed stubborn, because asking the man whose buried chimney he had mocked for a year was a price he was not sure his pride could pay. Hiram settled it. He rode to Bell's store on the morning of the 4th day and said, "You are losing money because you are afraid of a man who knows more about chimneys than you do. Stensland will fix your flue if you ask him. He will not gloat. He is not that kind of man. But you will have to walk to his cabin and ask, and you will have to do it where people can see, because that is how trust works on this prairie. You cannot mock a man's work in public and then ask for his help in private." Bell came that afternoon. He came in front of Hiram, who had ridden along to make sure he actually arrived. He came in front of Nels Bredesen, who happened to be at the cabin hauling stone for his second room, and who stopped loading when he saw Bell walking up the path. He came in front of Miss Morrow, who was reviewing the schoolhouse clean-out schedule at the table, and who looked up from her papers with the controlled expression of a woman who had carried 6 children through a blizzard because the man now standing in the doorway had spread laughter instead of help. Bell stood in the doorway. He did not enter. He looked at the warm floor. He looked at the stove, banked low, the bypass closed, the system breathing quietly the way it had breathed for a year. He looked at Ragna, who was cleaning a clean-out lid with a wire brush, and who did not stop cleaning when Bell appeared because she had decided, at the age of 10, that a man who had called her father a grave builder did not warrant the courtesy of interrupted work. "My chimney needs inspection," Bell said. The words cost him. Every person in the room could see the cost, in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his hands hung at his sides as though he did not know what to do with them, in the careful flatness of his voice that was trying not to sound like begging and was not entirely succeeding. Odman put on his coat. He did not make Bell wait. He did not make him explain. He did not remind him of the words spoken in doorways or at store counters or repeated by children at the schoolhouse. He walked to the store and inspected the chimney the way he inspected any chimney, methodically, carefully, with his hands and his eyes and the tapping hammer that Ragna had taught him to carry. The crack ran 18 inches along the south face. The mortar was river mud layered over Torgrim's original lime work. Odman found 2 additional weak points above the crack where thermal cycling had loosened the brick courses. He identified the cause. Green coal burned too hot in a dirty flue, expanding the brick faster than the mortar could absorb. "You need to repoint the upper 8 courses," Odman said. "Proper mortar, lime, sand, ash, horsehair. Clean the flue before you refire, and stop burning green coal. Season your fuel, or buy seasoned, but do not put green coal in a chimney this old and expect the brick to forgive you." Bell stood beside him in the cold store and listened without interrupting. Hiram watched from the doorway. Nels leaned against his wagon on the street. Miss Morrow stood with her hands in her coat pockets, and her face composed into an expression that gave nothing away, though her eyes missed nothing. "You also need to stop selling cracked tile," Odman said. Bell's jaw worked. The words came slowly, as though pulled from a depth where pride and sense had been fighting for days, and sense had won by a margin so thin that pride could still feel the bruise. "Then tell me which ones will kill a man, Stensland." It was not an apology. It was not friendship. It was not redemption. It was surrender. Not to Odmund, but to the evidence that had been accumulating since January. Evidence written in warm floors and cracked chimneys, and the silence of men at a store counter who had stopped laughing months ago. Bell would never like Odmund. He would never admit the buried chimney had been anything other than a gamble. But he would stop selling cracked tile, because his own chimney had just demonstrated what bad masonry does, and that was a lesson even Bell could not argue with from the street. Odmund repointed Bell's chimney over 2 days. He charged $3 pulser das, the same price Torgrim had charged the previous year. Bell paid without bargaining, and when the store reopened, warm and clean, Bell did not mention the floor or the chimney or the man who had fixed both. He sold dry goods, and he kept his flue clean, and the phrase he had coined died the quiet death that words die when the world outgrows them. Odman married Elva Morrow on the 12th of June, 1889, after the school term ended and the roads dried and the prairie turned the color of new money. The courtship had been built from shared labor across the spring. Through March and April and May, Elva spent her free hours at the Stensland cabin, not visiting but working. She revised the safety instructions. She wrote letters to homesteaders along the Upper James River Road, describing the method and inviting them to see the schoolhouse installation. She helped Odmund redesign the warming bench along the north wall, arguing for a lower profile so smaller children could sit on it without climbing, and winning the argument with a demonstration that involved Peter, a stool, and a bruised knee that proved her point faster than words could. They worked side by side and disagreed frequently, and respected each other's competence in the particular way of two people who had survived the same emergency, and who measured character not by charm, but by what a person did when the room filled with smoke. The proposal, if it could be called that, happened on a Tuesday evening in late May. Elva arrived carrying a stack of copied safety sheets. The latest revision, incorporating the spring flooding lessons, the Halvorsen incident, and a new section on chimney cleaning schedules that she had written without consulting Odmund because she was right about the cleaning intervals and did not need his permission to say so. She found that Odmund had built a writing shelf along the north wall, near the warmest section of floor, where the clay run passed closest beneath the surface. The shelf was pine, planed smooth, set at a height for writing while seated on the bench below. Beside it, he had mounted a small hook for a lantern. "Is that for me?" Elva asked. "For whoever keeps the rules straighter than I do," Odmund said. Ragna was at the table cleaning a clean-out lid with a wire brush. She looked at Elva. She looked at her father. She set down the brush, stood, and took Torgrim's mason's line from the nail above the stove. She carried it across the room and placed it on the writing shelf beside Elva's stack of safety sheets. Elva picked up the mason's line. She turned the coil in her hands. The old cord, darkened by smoke and lime dust, still taut after 2 years on the nail. She looked at Odmund. "This was Torgrim's," she said. "It belongs in the house," Odmund said, "near the work." Elva set the line on the shelf beside her papers. She did not ask the question that the shelf was already answering. The mason's line beside the safety sheet said everything that needed to be said, that the work was shared, that the house was shared, that the knowledge they were building would outlast both of them if they built it together. They married at the schoolhouse. Hiram stood as witness. Nels brought a wagon load of riverstone. "For the next floor," he said, "or the next cabin, or whatever the mason builds next." Peter wore a clean shirt that Elva had pressed, and he stood beside his father with the careful gravity of a 6-year-old who understood that the important things in life happened quietly and required your best clothes. The years moved the way years move on the prairie, in seasons, not in days. Their first winter as a married household set the pattern for the decades that followed. Elva brought order to Odmund's teaching, not by changing what he taught, but by writing it down in language that a homesteader's wife could read aloud while her husband worked in the pit. She created a sequence, first the pit dimensions, then the slope calculation, then the tile layout, then the mortar recipe, then the bypass installation, then the test procedure. Odmund had kept all of this in his head and in his hands. Elva put it on paper, and paper traveled further than a man on foot. Their first argument as a married couple was about the warming bench. Elva wanted a second bench installed along the east wall of the new cabin. Odmund was planning. A bench low enough for children to sit on, wide enough to dry 3 pairs of boots at once. Odmund said the east wall had insufficient clearance from the chimney base. Elva said the clearance could be increased by moving the chimney 4 inches west. Odmund said moving the chimney would change the draft. Elva said, "Then calculate the new draft and tell me if it works." He calculated. It worked. The east bench was built. They argued about heating the way other couples argued about planting, with investment, with specifics, and with the understanding that being right mattered less than building something that held. Odmund proved up his claim in the autumn of 1892, 5 years after filing. The land office in Mitchell recorded the improvement, a two-room sod-and-frame house with a brick thermal core replacing the original claim shack. The new house had a proper foundation, a deeper crawl space, and a refined version of the buried stone bed that incorporated every correction: wider cleanouts, a metal sliding bypass plate, drainage trenches along the foundation walls, and warming benches along two walls where boots and mittens dried while the floor breathed heat. Elva taught school for 4 more years. Their first child arrived in the winter of 1893, a boy they named Torgrim, called Tor, born in the warm room above the stone bed in heat his namesake had helped build. A daughter followed in 95, and another son in 98, and each of them grew up walking barefoot on warm boards in January and believing that all houses were this warm, the way children believe that the world their parents built is the world that has always existed. Odman taught versions of the system to settlers along the James River Road through the 90s. Each installation differed because each cabin differed, and Odman had learned from Torgrim, from flooding, from the Halverson failure, that a method could not be copied. It could only be understood and adapted. He taught the principle: capture exhaust heat in mass, release it slowly, seal every joint, clean every turn, trust your ears when testing tile and your candle when testing draft. He let the homesteaders build the specifics. Some built well. A homesteader named Espeland built a warming bench so precise that Ragna approved every joint on the first inspection, the only system in the county to pass without a single correction. Others built poorly and had to be corrected. A family named Solheim ran their tile with no slope and could not understand why soot collected in the elbows until Odman made them pour a cup of water into the channel and watch it pool instead of drain. "Water shows you what smoke cannot," Odman said. "Give it a path downhill and it will follow. Give it no path and it will sit and rot." Ragna grew into the sharpest eye in the county for draft and masonry. By 14, she could smoke test a joint faster than Odmund. By 16, she refused to approve any system she had not crawled under personally. Homesteaders learned to request her inspection, and those who tried to skip it found that Odmund would not approve their work until Ragna had cleared every joint. She carried the water tube, the level, and a small hammer for testing tile, and she struck each section with the same precise tap her father had used at Bell's counter, listening for the ring that meant sound clay and the thud that meant a crack waiting to become a mouth. Peter hauled freight on the Miller Road. He carried clay tile among his loads, sound tile from a supplier in Mitchell, tested and tapped before it left the yard. He never sold a cracked piece. When asked why he was particular about tile that most haulers treated as cheap commodity, he said, "My father taught me what cracked tile sounds like, and he taught me what it does." The community changed in the way communities change when knowledge replaces luck. Children dried mittens on warming benches instead of sleeping in damp wool. Neighbors inspected chimneys before the first frost instead of after the first smoke incident. The schoolhouse held storm drills each October. Miss Morrow's protocol, refined annually, practiced until even the smallest children knew which direction to walk and whose cabin to reach for. Families marked clean-out days on the same calendar as planting, because both were maintenance of systems that kept people alive. The change was visible in small things. A homesteader's wife would tap a tile section at the store before buying it, the way Odman had taught them, and the sound of a hammer on clay became as ordinary in Hand County as the sound of an axe on wood. Men who had laughed at the buried chimney in 1887 now discussed mortar recipes at the feed store with the seriousness of men discussing seed variety. Because mortar, like seed, was something you got right before you put it in the ground, or you paid for the mistake all winter. Hiram Voss, who had told Odman to sell his stove and abandon his claim, became the most reliable advocate for chimney inspection in the township. He rode the roads each autumn and stopped at every homestead and asked to see the flue. Those who had not cleaned their chimneys received a lecture that was short and direct, and that always ended with the same sentence: "I have seen a man die of what comes through a bad joint. Do not make me see it again." He never mentioned that the man who had changed his mind was a 31-year-old widower with a spade and a pile of cracked drain tile. He did not need to. Everyone already knew. In 1900, Odman built his last full stone bed for a family named Kavama, new to the county, who had heard about the method from a freight driver who had heard it from Peter. Odman was 44. His hands were the hands Torgrim had described, thick, scarred, cracked at the knuckles, stained with lime that no amount of scrubbing would lift. He could still lay tile by feel and read a candle flame for leakage from across a room. But he knelt slower and rose harder, and when the Kavame pit was dug and the tile laid, he stood at the edge and looked down at the serpentine run and saw his own floor from 13 years earlier, the same path, the same physics, the same gamble that a man could teach stone to hold fire. Young Vame, 26, stood beside him and asked, "How do you know it will work?" Odman said, "Because the man who taught me made me rebuild a joint 3 times until I could do it without thinking. And when you can do something without thinking, you are no longer gambling, you are building." Ragna crawled under the floor for the final inspection. She tapped every tile. She checked every joint with cold smoke and a candle flame. She emerged with clay in her hair and mortar on her elbows and said, "It is clean." Every tile rang clean. Every joint held. By 1905, Ragna had taken over the inspections entirely. Elva maintained the safety rules from the writing shelf, updating each autumn with notes from the previous winter. 20 years of revisions covered the shelf, corrections, additions, arguments with Odmund resolved in pencil and preserved in ink, a paper record of everything they had learned together about keeping heat where it belonged. Odmund's own system ran for 30 winters. He replaced the mortar twice. He replaced 4 tile sections that had finally cracked after decades of thermal cycling. He rebuilt 1 elbow box, the third, the same one Torgrim had made him rebuild 3 times in a single afternoon. When he took the old mortar apart, he found, pressed into the clay behind the brick, a faint impression he had never noticed, a thumbprint, dried into the mortar, left by a hand that had checked the joint and found it good and had moved on to the next thing without mentioning it to anyone. He held the brick fragment with the thumbprint for a long time. He turned it in the light. The print was clear, the whorls, the ridges, the specific shape of Torgrim Assen's left thumb pressed into wet clay on a November night in 1887 in a pit dug by a man with bleeding hands, while a 9-year-old girl held a lantern and a 5-year-old boy slept in the corner. He sealed the new mortar around the print and left it where it was. Some things were not meant to be cleaned away. In 1916, late in March, a storm came through that reminded the older people of 1888. Not as sudden, not as deadly, but cold enough and long enough to test every chimney and every warming bench and every buried stone bed in the county. Odmund was 60. Elva was 54. Ragna was 38, married, living on a claim of her own 3 miles west with a stone bed she had designed herself and a set of clean-out lids so precisely fitted that she could hear a draft change before she could see it. Peter was 34, hauling freight with 2 wagons and tile that rang. Odmund sat on the warm floor during the storm and watched his grandchildren. 3 of them, Rana's 2 and young Tor's oldest, sat in a circle on the boards near the center of the run, where the heat was strongest. They were rolling river stones from hand to hand. The stones were warm from the floor, heated by yesterday's fire stored in the mass beneath. The children passed them back and forth, laughing when a stone was too hot to hold for long, competing to see who could keep the warmest one longest. A game born from physics, played on a floor built from grief and necessity, in a house that remembered every fire it had ever been fed. Elva sat beside the stove correcting papers. Not her own students anymore, but papers from the school where Ragna's eldest daughter was learning cursive. The mason's line hung on its nail above the stove. The bypass was closed. The stones beneath the floor held the morning's fire and would hold it through the night and into the next morning, the way they had held it for 29 winters without a single night when the children's feet touched cold wood. The floor was warm. The house remembered. Within 2 winters of the blizzard of January 1888, 9 households and the Hand County Schoolhouse used some form of the heat storage method that Odmund Stensland and Torgrim Assen had built beneath a claim shack floor. The systems varied: full stone beds, brick benches, channel walls. but each one carried the same checklist, copied first on slate by Elva Morrow and then on paper by Ragna Stensland, posted inside the door of every building it protected. Warm the chimney, test the joints, clean the turns, never trust cracked tile. The checklist hung inside the schoolhouse door for 31 years, replaced 4 times when the paper wore through, always in Ragna's handwriting because her letters were the ones the children could read. Oddman Stensland lived out his life on the Hand County claim he had nearly abandoned in the autumn of 1887. He proved up the land, married Elva, raised Ragna and Peter and the children who came after, and kept Torgrim's mason's line coiled on the same nail where he had hung it the night after the burial. He died in April of 1921 during the thaw, not during a storm, quietly in the warm room with the floor still holding the last fire's heat beneath his feet. His family did not find money hidden away. They found labeled clean-out lids stacked on a shelf. They found spare clay in a sealed tin. They found a box of smooth river stones, worn by decades of small hands that his grandchildren had warmed their feet on every winter of their lives. On the night of January 12th, 1888, Orrin Bell had stood in a doorway and looked at a trench and a pile of cracked tile and 2 children eating cold biscuits over an open pit, and he had said, "That chimney will remember the sky only after your children stop breathing." He had been so certain. The mockery had traveled so fast. The laughter had closed so many hands. But the chimney did not remember the sky. It remembered the stone, and the stone remembered the fire, and the fire, fed by a man who had learned from his mother to feel the wall instead of the flame, kept burning long after the men who laughed had gone home to their own cold rooms. The cabin was dark now, except for banked coals. The stove was not roaring. Outside, wind scraped the grass flat and drove snow against the south wall the way it had driven snow against that wall for 30 winters. Inside, a child stepped barefoot from quilt to floor and did not flinch. Beneath the boards, beneath the tamped clay and the flat capstones, one round river stone held yesterday's fire. On that prairie, Oddman Stensland did not find more wood. He taught the house to remember heat,